He said he'd give 100 million to anyone who could open it. Everyone laughed. No one expected anyone to take him seriously. Victor Hale's morning was the kind of ritual that confirmed to him, in ways both small and enormous, that the world bent to his appetite. Curtains drew back on a skyline that had been commissioned, lit by the precise angle of light that leaked through the glass, reflecting off a dozen logos his companies owned. An assistant cleared his schedule with a practiced smile. A tray arrived with coffee poured at the exact temperature he preferred. The day unfurled like one of the contracts on his desk, sleek, predictable, irrevocable. He did not so much walk through his office as glide over it, eyes trained towards margins, the places where money was made or could be made. He noticed the safe the same way a man notices a rare painting, worth more for its provenance than its function. The case had been brought in under a veil of secrecy, the courier team told to expect no questions. It sat on a custom plinth in the conference room, matte black, armed with a panel of lights that pulsed like a small, stubborn heart. For Victor, the safe was a toy, a new challenge to remind everyone whose laughter mattered. For his board, it was a risk wrapped in spectacle. For his public relations director, it was an event, a pressable moment to generate headlines, perhaps to distract from a regulatory hearing scheduled for next quarter. For a handful of employees, it was an annoyance, security protocols, extra paperwork. Nobody, at least not inside the glass towers, imagined it was anything other than another layer of theater. 2 blocks away, beneath the same sun, Leo Rivera zipped his helmet chin strap and checked the tire pressure on an old Kawasaki that had more personality than polish. He wiped grease from a palm with a stained rag and thumbed the edge of a photograph tucked in the inside pocket of his jacket. His little sister, Rosa, laughing with a chipped mug, their mother asleep in the single bed still smelling faintly of hospital antiseptic. He threaded his boot into the pedal, and without making more of the morning than necessity required, he steered toward the city. Leo was 28, compact and quick, a courier by trade, a mechanic by stubbornness, the sort of person who knew the exact sound a carburetor made when it wanted sympathy. His hands had the vocabulary of labor, calloused knuckles, grease under the nails, the faint crescent scar from a childhood accident repaired with careful hospital stitches and a fierce refusal to be small. People often mistook him for a delivery man with nothing more than a phone in a bag. They missed the way his eyes cataloged patterns in the world, the subtle alignment of teeth in a gear, the rhythm of traffic, the architecture of a city that moves and repeats. Between the billionaire's conference room and Leo's garage, there was a city of such repeated patterns.
Commuters moved in measured waves. A news helicopter circled like a vulture. But the two worlds swam in different currents, glass towers and grease-stained counters, cufflinks and leather gloves. The safe did not arrive with fanfare. It was unloaded in hush, tucked into the most secure of the company's rooms, under the supervision of external specialists and a lawyer who had learned to say confidential with a voice that made it seem like law. The specialists looked serious, expensive in the way men wearing the right quiet clothes at the right height of competence look serious. They ran their diagnostic tablets, they tapped, they made notes. The panel lights blinked sequences the specialists called deliberate. They could crack almost any system through method and money. Still, after hours of coaxing and professional stubbornness, the safe did not yield. Victor watched them fail with the particular cruelty of someone who had spent a life buying competence and rejecting it for the thrill of power. It was a small, delicious pleasure to watch professionals offer plausible explanations and then watch their confidence shrink. "It's designed to resist brute force," the chief technician said at one point, meaning it as a confession. Victor nodded as if confirming how fine his taste for puzzles was. Already he imagined a headline that could be stitched from the moment: Victor Hale and the safe that wouldn't yield. He smiled at the thought of the anecdote being told later, the one where he ordered the safe simply to entertain himself. That afternoon he convened a rare open assembly, a press-friendly 12-person boardroom crowd with cameras on the outskirts and chairs for the interns that he liked to see squirm, a spectacle he enjoyed because it was both performance and a test of the world's reflex. "We'll make it a show," he told them. His voice carried no uncertainty. He relished the angle of surprise that made people reveal themselves. The safe sat at the center like a black star. A decorative placard announced its contents only in the legalistically coy language of the company: bearer instruments, secure custody. The legal advisor, Don Alberto, salt hair, a courtroom cadence, offered a cautionary voice about publicity,
but he spoke to the room as one gives first aid rather than a sermon. Publicity complicates agreement, he said. Promises made in jest can become binding in the eyes of the public. Victor raised a hand, dismissive. Promises are made all the time, he said. I'll give 100 million if anyone here can open this. He said it true to his posture, offhand, almost as if naming a number were the same as adjusting a thermostat. Laughter rippled like someone snapping a towel. That was the exact moment cameras sharpened. That was the moment the phrase found its way into phones and the world outside the glass.
Someone in the back of the room captured the sound of that laugh, edited it with a zoom on Victor's face, and uploaded it 12 seconds later with a caption that felt like a guillotine. Open it and get paid. Victor thinks it's a joke. Those 12 seconds were a seed. Outside the building, Leo delivered a stack of small boxes to a cafe and took the chance to check his messages. One ping after another dimmed the screen. A clip of Victor, a caption, a mocking comment, a flurry of shares. The clip had nothing special in it if you looked at it objectively, a man making a cruel bet. But the world had a taste for spectacles, and this one smelled of both entitlement and humiliation. People who spent their days outside marble lobbies recognized the tone. They could see themselves in the laughter he offered. They could see their fathers at a table, their own small embarrassments, the quiet work that made others uncomfortable. Carolina, Victor's executive assistant, watched the footage back in the cool quiet of the archives room. She had been in his orbit long enough to read the architecture of his cruelty. She was practical, with an uncompromising ethics bone that made her a private enemy of spectacle dressed as leadership. She had seen Leo before. He'd carried a lunch tray once, had fixed a glitch on the building's service elevator when contractors were unavailable, had left a note apologizing for the mess he'd had to make in the stairwell. He had a reputation inside her register not for show, but for work that picked up other people's slack. She forwarded the clip to a private contact list with no commentary. The forwarding had nothing to do with rebellion and everything to do with a pulse she could not name. Once the clip traveled, the tide that follows any small but intense spectacle began to swell. Comments multiplied. The soundbite became a wave. Victor's bet, originally intended as a private vindication of a self-image, now had an audience arranged like a jury. The city loved an underdog. It loved someone undercutting a scornful lift. The internet is impatient with arrogance. Content is quick to circle. The richer you are, the closer you're scrutinized. Victor underestimated the simplest law of modern shame. If the world had the power to amplify a laugh, it had equal power to hold someone accountable if the laugh was backed by a public vow. Leo did not find the clip for moral reasons. He found it because his sister Rosa texted him a link with 3 crying laugh faces and a note. Is this the guy you were talking about? Dude, he looks like a cartoon. Leo clicked more out of distraction than intention. The image of Victor was framed by a room of cushioned laughter. Leo felt the laugh as if it were a gust. It unsettled him in a way quiet everyday humiliations did, the type that asked a person to shrink when they did not have the means to do so gracefully. He forwarded the clip to his mother's group chat with an extra line. Just saw this.
Can you imagine? Mom replied with a short string of emojis and a voice memo low with a weary chuckle. Rosa wrote, "If someone opens that, can we get a new mattress?" A practical hope that felt daring for someone used to making small demands survive. The world watched as Victor pushed forward with the stunt. He announced, with a showman's flourish, a public invitation, the way a ringmaster offers the next dare. It would be at midday, in the atrium, with press and staff and live streams. He raised the stakes as a joke at first, 1 million, then 5, then the number that made the room gasp, the full 100 million if any single person opened the safe. He said it like a man declaring rules for a game he expected to win. "If anyone from outside my hired experts opens it," he said, "I will hand them the money on the spot." There are words that cut softer if delivered with certain inflections. Said that way, the promise was both an entitlement and a provocation. It invited spectacle and scoff alike. For Victor, it was a test of superiority. For the crowd, it was an opportunity to see what arrogance would do when given a stage. The internal legal department frowned. Don Alberto wrote memos that spoke to precedent and liability. Carolina, who had access to the schedule and the list of invited journalists, watched the thread of chat along with the external reaction. Her pragmatism looked for containment. But there was also something irrepressibly human in her response. A small private list in her head of people who do real labor in and around the building. The night janitor who sang to herself while polishing the chrome. The old groundskeeper who knew the patterns of when to prune. The couriers who threaded the city like arteries. The arrogance of the joke felt personal, and that personal feeling is what makes people act. Leo did not think of 100 million as currency to spend. He thought of it the way you think of sunlight when it falls into a room you've been keeping shuttered, a sudden possibility for wrongs to be set right. He thought of the mattress for Rosa. He thought of his mother's oxygen tank and the months of bills that arrived like paper nets under their feet. The number was obscene and ridiculous, and yet when he watched the clip the second time, he felt the strange pull of a game not designed for him.
That morning, he had one delivery remaining, an overnight package for the 21st floor. The building's public area was noisier than usual. Cameras had been arranged as if the atrium were a theater. Staff had been told to gather, an encouragement to witness. The safe glinted in the center as a dark promise. He did not plan to enter. He tied his jacket tight and left his helmet on in the lobby to keep the wind off his face. A security guard recognized the motorcycle jacket and barked the routine question, ID, purpose. Leo answered in the clipped sentences of someone who did this job every day.
He was waved through with a nod, though a couple of people in reception made the automatic move of turning the phone to his face, as if to capture the image of the messenger among silk and sparkle. He felt the cameras like a draft on the back of his neck. At the edge of the crowd, Carolina watched him arrive. She saw the way he stood with his hands tucked against his jacket, the way he scanned the room with a focus that had nothing to do with the spectacle and everything to do with observation. He moved like someone who had learned to be present without demand. She remembered the elevator fix, the note, the apology for being late. She remembered the pair of gloves left on a stairwell railing to dry. She thought of the quiet dignity of that kind of work. Victor, in his tailored suit, was a dog show of dominance, posture, scent, crowdsourcing of laughs. He loved the tempo of public humiliation that concluded with a wry sentence and a signature. He shaped the moment like a sculptor, a line here for tension, a laugh there for release. He tossed the challenge into the room like a coin to be caught. "Anyone who can open it," he said, and then laughed the way people do when they assume they have already won. From the back of the room somebody shouted, half in jest, half in longing. A murmur went through the crowd, the sort that alternates between cruelty and curiosity. Someone else clapped. Another person told a joke about what they would buy if they had 100 million, and the atmosphere short-circuited into a carnival, a place where outrage and amusement are interchangeable. Leo's name was not called. He had not come to be spectacle. He had come to make a delivery. And yet he found himself moving nearer. Maybe it was the way the safe looked less like a vault and more like an insult that could be opened with the right humility. Maybe it was the photograph in his pocket. Maybe he was tired of being watched as invisible. Carolina did not shout him out. She did not have to. She caught his eye and made a small gesture. Just a nod, a tilt of the chin toward the safe. Not an invitation exactly, more a question. The kind that asks whether a person prefers to keep to themselves or to be the first person in a story that will be told for years. He hesitated only the space of a breath. He thought of his mother's cough, his sister's mattress, and the way doors had always closed softly but persistently in his family. He stepped forward. The room fell into the kind of silence that arrives not because people decided to be quiet, but because they want to feel the center of a scene. Cameras refocused, the live feed spiked, and the word, "Who is he?" moved through the posts and comments in the same way a current moves through water. Some people recognized him as one of the delivery couriers. Some thought him a prank. Others, watching in the street, called him brave. "Sir," he said to Victor, who had the smile of someone who had already decided the outcome.
Victor's amusement sharpened. "Yeah?" he asked. "You want a job or a miracle?" Leo kept his voice even. "I don't want your pity," he said. "I was wondering if this is open to anyone." The laughter in the room had the sound of people watching a television program. Victor's eyes flicked in a manner that suggested small sizing up. His instinct was to monetize the moment. He liked challenges in the abstract, but only the ones that confirmed his map of who could win. He was given to the idea that most people would bow at the waterline and admire him for it. "No," Victor said. "It's a show. This is entertainment. Experts have tried. The point is, it requires money, tools, and talent you probably can't afford." Leo smiled in a way that had no currency in it. "I'm not here for entertainment," he replied. "I work on things that stick. I fix things by looking." There are ways of saying nothing that tell you everything. Victor chose such a phrase to close the door. He gestured grandly toward the safe. "All right," he said louder, enjoying the gasp, the sense of a crowd snapping attention. "If you can open it, I'll hand you 100 million right now, on the floor. No lawyers, no conditions." Short sentences now. Quiet. The room recalibrated. Some of Victor's advisors tensed. Dom Alberto, at his elbow, mouthed the word no, which in legalese translated to alarm. Carolina, watching, felt the line between spectacle and binding promise shift. Leo, however, heard nothing but the measure of a challenge. He knew the real math of his life. Enough to keep the lights on for a few months, not enough to ever say the word comfortable without irony. The number was obscene, but the gesture,
The idea that an unseen person could stand before a room and change their course had a gravity of its own. "Do you accept?" Victor asked, as if offering a glass of water. Leo looked at the safe, at the panel of lights that blinked in sequences like a language. He reached out, not with force, but with a calm that made no promises. He placed his palm on the cool metal. Silence sharpened to the kind that exists before weather breaks. There was a camera a few rows back, its lens gleaming. Someone in the crowd whispered, the word filtering through the tape of the live stream. This could be a hoax. Another voice called out, "Let him try." Someone laughed nervously. Clips began to circulate with the subtitle, "Delivery Man Accepts Billionaire's Joke." Carolina, all professionalism and an unvoiced moral calculation, stepped forward and tapped her phone. The track of the clip would go on and on. She made the choice to provide an extra layer of witness, a live video calling from a small account to an independent journalist she trusted. Sometimes witness matters more than contract. She thought of the ways a society enforces its promises, not only in courts, but in the persistent gaze of the public. Leo did not look for permission.
He worked with permission he had never been asked for, the tacit consent of a person who keeps their hands willing and their eyes steady. He took a quiet breath and began to study the panel like someone reading a poem. There was no showman's flourish in his movement. It was the opposite, patient, close, reverent, in the way one treats a mechanism that has been given a life by someone's choices. He did not speak. He listened with his fingertips. He absorbed the cadence of the lights as if they were a sentence with a missing word. He allowed his mind to make small connections, to sense patterns his job had taught him to notice, how torque wore metal, how repetition leaves traces, how people build things to be used, and to be understood by someone who knows how to pay attention. At first, nothing seemed to happen. The room murmured, phones recorded. Jokes started up again in the back, brittle and nervous. Victor leaned back, satisfied with the spectacle he had manufactured. He watched with an indulgent grin, already picturing himself in the press later, the magnanimous clown who invented a game. And then, very quietly, something shifted. It was not a click meant to instruct. It was a shift in rhythm. The lights stuttered for half a heartbeat, then settled into a new order. He adjusted his weight and let his hands move with a care that suggested years of making small things run right. The safe had been built to resist measurement. Leo used something else, a patient sensitivity, the ability to hold a question until the mechanism answered. It was not luck. It was almost a kind of literacy, one that learned the grammar of objects through daily work rather than the sterile language of a lab. When the final confirmation chimed, a small, honest sound that could have been a door unlocking or a child's toy coming to life, it landed like a pebble in a still pond. The sound was so ordinary it nearly passed unnoticed until the room shifted around it. For a single second, no one moved. Then the reaction came in a rush, laughter that faltered, a collective intake of breath, the tiny clack of shoes as dozens of people leaned forward, phones tilted toward the scene. Victor's laughter died on his lips in a way that made its intention visible. He had expected to be the entertainer, and suddenly the script had been stolen. He looked at the safe and then at Leo with an astonishment that curved toward fury. "You," he said, as if the thing the man was had been a mistake. Leo wiped his hands on the leg of his jacket, as if to clean himself from the fold of the event, and then looked up. He did not smile triumphantly. He met Victor's gaze with something quieter, but far more dangerous to a man like Victor. There was no flattery, no deference. There was a dignity that refused to be made small for the sake of someone else's spectacle. The safe stood open a hair. Inside was a small sealed compartment, a place holding what the placard had coyly described in legalese.
The room was a storm of noise and disbelief. Comments exploded on the live stream. Spectators who had come to see a man humiliated were now watching the script flip in real time. Victor, for the first time in a long time, understood that his wager had a life of its own. His advisors murmured in clusters. Don Alberto's jaw worked. The legal maps unfurled across his mind like a set of directions with arrows pointing to inevitable consequences. Carolina, who had seen this man from the inside for years, felt something like a relief and a worry wrestle in her stomach. She moved to a notary's line, because witness matters, because 100 million offered in front of cameras is different from a private joke in his office, because the city will remember what it sees. Leo stood in the center of a room that had expected spectacle and delivered truth.
He felt no elation, only a steady current of something he had not allowed himself to feel often, the sense that work had been seen, that labor had been respected, by an act he had not planned to perform for applause. Around him, the crowd fractured into those who cheered, those who recoiled, and those who sniffed at their phones trying to catch the tone of it all. Victor's amusement was gone. "I didn't think anyone would actually—" he started, and then he stopped, because there is a peculiar kind of vulnerability that halts a man accustomed to always finishing his sentences. The world had watched him give a promise in careless laughter. Now it watched him confront the possibility of actually living by it. He opened his mouth. His next move would determine more than whether a balance cleared. It would speak to the kind of person he was in full glare, the man who either corrected a humiliation or doubled down on the privilege that made humiliation possible. Outside the atrium, a swarm of posts gathered like clouds. The clip of Leo's fingers, the chime of the safe, Victor's frozen face, they circulated with 1,000 captions. Some celebrated, others smelled a scam. Online, a chorus was forming, asking a simple question: will he honor it? Inside, the room shifted from spectacle to consequence. Don Alberto's hand found the arm of Victor's chair as if to anchor him to law. Carolina's phone continued to stream. Across the city, people took a breath and waited. The moment had become larger than any one person's intention. It had become a mirror. Leo stepped back from the safe and did the only thing a man who has always measured his life in small, careful acts could do. He looked to see if his family was watching, to see if the hands that had taught him to be steady would be steady today. His sister had been one of the first to comment online. His mother, when he called her that evening, would ask if he had eaten. He did not know what the future would ask of him. He knew only what the present required, to stand with the truth of his labor and let the world decide if it would keep its promises.
The last frame of the open safe became a hinge the city had to notice. For Victor, a choice hung in the air like the scent of someone deciding whether to apologize or retreat. For Leo, the world had shifted under his feet, but the rhythm of his life remained. Bills, shift schedules, a sister who needed a mattress, a mother who needed quiet. The cameras shone, the phones buzzed, the live stream hit a peak. The billionaire's laugh had been replaced by the low math of obligation. The room waited for the next move. If a man with everything can be accountable in a room full of witnesses, what does that accountability look like? Would it be a single envelope handed across a table, the flash of a check in a camera, a press release? Or would it be a deeper thing, a change that altered policies, created opportunities, and fixed the things that allowed such a bet to be thought funny in the first place? Those were questions that would not be answered by a chime and a flash, and they were questions whose answers would ripple far beyond the atrium. For now, the safe was open, the number had been said, and a quiet man with grease on his hands stood where a spectacle had planned for him to be small. The world leaned forward. If this story feels like the kind of thing you want to see more of, real people, upheaval, and the slow work of justice, subscribe for more stories like this. There are other people in other cities who, like Leo, hold the change we need in fingers that the world has not learned to look at. The cameras were still pointing. The clip spread. The public had not yet given its verdict. Victor swallowed. He could still choose to laugh and walk away. He could still call a lawyer and make 1,000 pragmatic arguments about performative offers and legal loopholes. He could make the moment dissolve into another press release. Or he could honor the word that had rolled out of his mouth as if it were a thing trivial to toss. Honor would not be easy. It would cost him, publicly and privately. It would force his board to reckon with how spectacle and accountability collided. It would demand more than a single payment. It would require a gaze inward. The crowd waited for which of those paths he would choose. No one in the room that midday was prepared for the sound that came next. The low hum of phones capturing the face of a man whose ego had met someone who would not step away. Cameras zoomed. Victor's jaw tightened. Leo wiped his hands again and looked at the open safe, at the little sealed compartment where paper, signatures, or instruments sat in quiet constraint. The city, through a net of streaming images and whispered conjectures, held its breath. Outside, a teenager 2 miles away watched the clip and imagined things he had never allowed himself to imagine. An intern in the building drafted an email in case something broke. A union organizer bookmarked the footage. Inside the room, Victor rose from his chair.
The sound of his shoes on the marble felt like an announcement. He walked toward the safe. The world leaned in. The rest of the story depends on what he does when he reaches it. Victor's steps echoed on the marble as if he were walking through his own conscience.
The atrium held its breath. Cameras whirred. 100 unseen viewers leaned forward. Don Alberto reached for the edge of the mahogany table, as if to anchor the law itself to the floor. Carolina's thumb hovered over a call. The moment had crystallized, a promise offered in a laugh, and now a man who had been mocked as a mere spectacle stood with his hands clean of theatrics and the safe yawning like a question. When Victor stood before the open compartment, he did not reach for the money. He did not even look at the faces that peered through the cameras. He looked at Leo, as if looking could rearrange the facts. In that look there was calculation, and unexpectedly the shadow of something softer, an echo of the small boy who had once been told that to win was to be seen. For a heartbeat he seemed poised to accept the truth. A man had done what he had promised to reward. Then he spoke. "Don Alberto," he said, low enough that only the people closest to him caught the new edge. "Prepare the ledger. We will—" He stopped mid-sentence. The lawyers on his shoulder straightened, as if to add a clause to that unfinished verb. The murmurs rippled through the room like an approaching tide. Don Alberto, who had spent a career translating moral hazard into legal maps, folded his hands and said nothing. He understood words were different on paper than in the air. Carolina, watching him closely, felt the room tilt toward performance again. The cameras captured Victor's first movement, which was to reach for the nearest microphone, and, in a voice that was meant for press releases, announce something tidy and safe. "I will honor the promise," Victor said into the microphone, each syllable chosen like a line of credit. "We will make arrangements right now." Relief moved through the crowd like a ripple. In the press feeds online, the comment counters twitched toward a pause. But in the moments that followed, the relief hardened into a different texture: suspicion. Because promises made under the glare of light often acquire conditions when translated into contracts. Victor had built a life on the art of framing reality. To simply hand over a sum of such magnitude without clause was a move as costly as it was rare. His advisors, loath to be trapped in a headline without a strategy, murmured beneath their breath. The company's PR director, a pale woman who had never learned to take the long view of apology, leaned in with a list of talking points that fell like leaves from some safer tree. "We'll structure a payment," she said. "We'll activate escrow. We'll create a donation channel." The verb suggested control: installments, trustees, third-party audits.
Victor had grown up in a world where obligations were turned into hedges, and hedges were turned into narratives. Carolina's eyes met Don Alberto's. He had seen the arc before. A wealthy man, startled into humility, attempts to convert an immediate moral demand into a regulatory mechanism. The law could help, but it could also be used as a moat. Don Alberto's counsel was practical and blunt. "If this is to be a real fulfillment," he said, "we must do it before an independent witness, notarize the exchange, and make sure the terms are clear. You spoke before cameras. That speech has weight. Public promises can be enforceable." His voice carried the kind of authority that had forced suits and reputations into new shapes. Victor, who had never been fond of being taught the mechanics of humility, understood the risk in Don Alberto's words. There was a way to step back, scrub the optics, and say that what had happened was a gift, not a legally binding transfer. There was also a way to stand in the light and accept what his own voice had set in motion. He tasted both options like two wines. One would preserve his control, the other would cost him. He chose the cost. That choice did not arrive as a cinematic repentance. It arrived as a ledger entry that he signed in public, with a notary walk-in, a legal team present, and Carolina's steady insistence that witnesses be recorded beyond the flashy circle of the press. She placed a document on the table that read simply and carefully, not in the convoluted language of corporate defense, but in language anyone could understand. Victor Hale had publicly promised to deliver $100 million to the person who opened the safe. The company recognized that promise and would proceed to fulfill it without the imposition of hidden conditions. "Bring a notary," she said to a junior associate, and the association was real rather than performative. A public official with a stamped certificate, signatures, and a recorded timestamp. Don Alberto, ever cautious, supervised the neat language and added a clause that would anchor the gift against future legalistic reinterpretation. The funds would be delivered as liquid assets to the person identified at the time of the event, and any additional reparative measures the company committed to would be structured under a foundation with oversight that included independent community representatives. The crowd watched as the document grew witnesses. Cameras focused on the notary stamp like it was a talisman. Someone recorded on a personal phone. Carolina streamed to a journalist. The city's feed caught the moment and held it. It would become part of the public record. Victor signed with a flourish that had once meant control. But this ink tasted different.
He felt the weight of a reality he had not always allowed himself to consider, that his words could demand accountability. The public angle shifted.
What at first had been a theater of entertainment now demanded constancy. Investors called, partners asked for clarity, news anchors asked tough questions. The board demanded a meeting about reputational risk. Victor's telephone sang like an anxious bird. He could have retreated into the fortress of counsel and spun platitudes, but the notary stamp and the streaming footage had drawn a line. Inside the atrium, the atmosphere transformed from spectacle to mechanism. Leo, whose hands had just opened a compartment that carried more than paper, stood measured and still. The room expected him to be overwhelmed. He was not. He moved with the quiet steadiness of a man raised on small obligations, a man who had learned early that promises accumulate and compound. A legal representative approached, not an adversary, but a professional translation of practicalities. Don Alberto, with his careful tempo, explained that there were logistic matters to attend to: identity verification, immediate transfer or escrow, tax implications, and the more delicate issue of consent. Leo was, after all, a private man suddenly thrust into the public light. He needed to be protected in ways that went beyond money: privacy options, security, and guidance. Leo listened and then spoke in the same clear, unadorned sentences that had steadied him in the atrium. He did not want to become a headline that lasted 3 days and left his family exposed to vultures. "I want my family to be safe first," he said. "I want Rosa to have a mattress and for my mom to have the medicine she needs. After that, I want this to help other people like me." It was not a refusal of help. It was an insistence that the moment was larger than a single fat envelope. The stipulation carried the moral clarity of someone who had spent a life refusing to be complicit in systems that celebrated spectacle but dispensed nothing to the people who kept a city running. Victor listened. The cameras caught the exchange, and the comments surged in real time. The internet, which at first wielded the clip like a knife, now watched a scene unfold where the billionaire could be measured by his follow-through. If he did the right thing, if he did more than write a check, this would become the kind of narrative that moved markets as well as morals. That afternoon turned to evening, as if drawn by the gravity of decisions. The company issued a statement promising to honor Victor's public words and to create a reparative program to address the disparity the wager had exposed. The language was careful but real: one-time funds for immediate family relief, establishment of a community training fund, and an internal review of company policies related to wage practices, contractor relationships, and employee health care. Words on paper were a start. The true measure would be in governance. Victor convened his board in a condensed emergency session that evening. Don Alberto quietly chaired the legal particulars.
The PR director suggested shaping the narrative with a staged ceremony that looked like commitment but smelled of spin. Carolina said nothing for a beat, and then, with a clarity that cut through the flurry of advisors, asked for community representation on the oversight panel. "If we're doing this right," she said, "it needs people who aren't hired to look pretty in a photo." A hush fell. The word oversight felt heavy in the room, signifying accountability beyond a press release. Leo himself, having been escorted to a quiet zone, agreed that any reparative effort should involve those affected, not just those orchestrating the optics. He named in a small, deliberate list people who represented community voices: a union rep, a neighborhood organizer, a community college instructor who had once mentored him. He suggested that the funds should not only relieve immediate needs, but invest in apprenticeship programs that would create pathways for people who had the skill but lacked access. Victor, who had once considered power a matter of unilateral decision, felt the wall of that moment press in. He had grown up believing that gestures, large, spectacular gestures, could create legacy. But the clarity in Leo's voice and the steady insistence from Carolina reframed legacy as responsibility, an ongoing structure that must be tended. The board voted, uncertainly and then with resolve. The company would honor the sum and commit to the foundation structure. They would assemble an independent oversight committee that included community stakeholders. They would open a vocational training fund focused on mechanical trades, logistics, and apprenticeships, fields where skill was often overlooked and undervalued. They would audit their own contracts and wage scales. The language was not perfect, but it was a beginning, an admission that spectacle could birth institutional correction. The night that followed blurred into a montage that the city would replay for weeks. Victor signing a check in front of cameras, a notary stamping a certificate, Leo standing with his sister and mother in a small living room, looking small beneath the weight of a future that looked frightening and possible. The first tranche of funds arrived in a way that was both private and public. Bank transfers for immediate medical bills and household repairs, coupled with an agreement to seed the foundation with an initial endowment and a legally binding commitment to create long-term programs. Public opinion, which had been volatile and merciless, shifted from demand to watchful optimism. People wanted to see follow-through. Comment threads that had once mocked now tracked progress. Journalists questioned motives and structures. Activists demanded transparency. The city, which had found in the video a mirror of daily injustices, pressed the company to do more than the minimum.
Victor learned that afternoon the difference between a performative apology and a program sustained by governance. He was forced, by the insistence of the city and the quiet clarity of Leo's moral ask, to remain present. At times, his old instinct to flee resurfaced, to reduce everything to numbers and protect the bottom line. But each attempt at retreat met the same two persistent facts. He had spoken in public, and the world had recorded it. The ledger of accountability, once opened, does not allow easy erasure. Weeks became months. The Rivera Initiative, a name Leo insisted carry his family's and neighborhood's identity, was established as an independent foundation with a board that included community representatives, vocational educators, and legal guardians. Carolina, who had long known how to navigate the corridors of influence, joined the oversight committee as an ex officio member to ensure that the company's efforts were not merely editorial. Don Alberto worked on the legal scaffolding that would make the foundation's commitments enforceable and transparent. Victor's company undertook an internal audit. The findings were inconvenient. Contracted workers had been classified in ways that minimized benefits. Health protections for couriers and night staff had gaps. Wages, though above statutory minimums, often did not reflect the real costs of living in a city with rising rent and living expenses. Each finding was a little revelation, the kind of thing a man like Victor might have read in a quarterly report and dismissed as an abstract cost. Facing them in the wake of a public promise changed the calculus. Under pressure, the company revised policies, increased contractor protections, a pilot program offering health stipends and wage adjustments for frontline workers, and the establishment of an apprenticeship pipeline linked to the Rivera Initiative. These measures were not a cure for systemic inequality, nor did they pretend to be. They were, however, steps produced under public scrutiny and framed by the insistence that dignity of labor matters. Leo became a reluctant public figure. He did not like the attention, didn't want to be famous, but he recognized an opportunity to move from personal relief to collective action. He used part of the funds to stabilize his family's immediate needs, a new mattress for Rosa, better medications, and a small modification to their apartment to accommodate his mother's oxygen machine. He invested in tools in a modest garage where he could expand from being a courier who happened to fix things into someone who trained apprentices. He insisted that the Rivera Initiative direct a significant portion of its resources to creating scholarships and workshops for young adults from neighborhoods like his. Victor watched these decisions unfold. There were moments, fewer than he expected, where he felt the old impulse to make the initiative about him.
He wanted the photo ops, the speeches that ended with tidy quotations. But Leo's insistence on community-led governance and the presence of a notary's stamp that could not be unmade forced a different posture. He found himself listening to people he had once dismissed as ancillary to his business. A union organizer who explained the day-in, day-out reality of temporary contracts. A community college professor who spoke convincingly about how practical training could shift a life's trajectory. A young apprentice who said simply, "I want to be paid what my work is worth." Over time, those small conversations changed Victor in ways he could not easily summarize. He still loved his skyline and his taste for craft, but the hunger to be admired lost its sheen to a quieter satisfaction, the knowledge that decisions he made could create infrastructure to lift people's lives. It was not an instantaneous nobility. It was messy and contradictory and required him to wrestle with his own past, a past of privilege, of dismissive laughter, and to transform it into something reparative. Publicly, Victor made a speech months later at a town hall convened by the Rivera Initiative. He did not attempt to rewrite his past. He confessed the casual arrogance of his wager, acknowledged the humiliation he had inflicted by turning a life into a bet, and committed to the hard work of institutional change. He spoke plainly, not grandly. His words were uneven, honest in their stuttering, but not theatrical. To many, it was a rare form of apology, not a single tidy moment for the cameras, but a willingness to stay in the room and be held accountable. The city responded in mixed ways. Some were suspicious, some cautiously approving, some still skeptical, but the measurable things the foundation supported began to quietly alter lives. Apprenticeships placed young people in paid, supervised roles. A stipend program helped couriers access better protective gear and medical help. Scholarships brought technical trainees to community college programs that had once been out of reach. Leo became a teacher in his own right. He began to lead weekend workshops in the garage he moved into with part of the funds. His hands, once used mostly to keep a family afloat, became instruments of training, and his humility translated into a pedagogy that combined practical skill with mentorship about dignity. He taught not out of charity, but from a conviction that competence deserves recognition. Students who had once assumed there was no path past courier jobs found openings into careers with stable wages and benefits.
Rosa, whose mattress had been a small, decisive symbol, took a part-time job managing the small repair shop's front desk. She learned to bless the way a life is altered by safety, not only financial safety, but also the knowledge that a family could breathe easier at night.
Their mother's cough eased with better care, and with that easing came other small freedoms, the ability to accept fewer second jobs, to sleep longer stretches, to plan. Years passed, and what had once been a viral moment became part of a longer narrative. The Rivera Initiative published annual reports that were read not only by philanthropists, but by activists and academics. Victor's company, now under the scrutiny of its own board, released its audit and announced a phased plan to harmonize contractor benefits across subsidiaries. Other corporations watched, and a few followed with similar pledges, not always out of pure moral desire, but often because the public had shown it would hold leaders accountable. Change does not follow straight lines. There were setbacks, funds occasionally misallocated, administrators of the foundation who needed replacing, contract disputes that required hard conversations. But those setbacks were treated not as PR crises to be smoothed, but as governance problems to be solved. The Oversight Committee, which included community voices, did not settle for spin. It demanded transparency and measured outcomes. Victor discovered that redemption is not a moment, but a ledger of deeds. He took on a new habit. Instead of retreating when criticized, he tried, awkwardly and often imperfectly, to stay in the conversation. He consented to audits, he sat in community meetings, and he allowed stories of hardship to shape corporate priorities. He continued to make mistakes. The difference was that he now had to answer to people who would not let the story be only his. For Leo, the world never became easy. He still rode the city's veins on his motorcycle, still carried packages, and still reveled in the pragmatic joys of making a stubborn machine behave. But his life had widened. He could imagine other people like him turning skill into stability. He became in the city's imagination, and in more practical ways, someone who had moved from private struggle to public purpose. He was not a savior, he was an exemplar of dignity reclaimed. A decade after the day the safe opened, a small ceremony marked the Rivera Initiative's 10th anniversary. The room was crowded with apprentices wearing work jackets, with parents whose children had been the first beneficiaries of scholarships, with board members from the company and community college instructors who now taught curriculum developed through partnerships. Victor stood at the back, not as a showman, but as someone who had become oddly at home in uncomfortable accountability. He stepped forward to deliver a few minutes of remarks. His voice had lost some of its performative polish, but gained an unadorned steadiness. "I thought giving was a kind of trophy," he said. "I learned that giving is work. It is a responsibility that requires people who know how to listen and who will hold you to what you say."
He paused and glanced at Leo, who stood in the front row, grease on his palms and a calm in his face that made Victor's expression fold into something like gratitude. Leo, thrust quietly into the light again, smiled in that small way that had first steadied a room. He had become, without intending it, a fixture in the scaffolding of the city. The apprentices cheered, the families applauded. The cameras, now more deliberate in their choice, recorded a story that had started with a mockery and had grown into a messy, imperfect, but persistent correction. That evening, as the crowd dispersed, Victor walked out into the city with a different awareness of how his laughter had landed in the world. For years afterward, he would tell people that the wager had been a moment that revealed a fault line in his own life, the belief that power absolved one from obligation. He began to mentor younger executives differently, insisting that public promises were binding in both letter and conscience. He stopped laughing at people who worked with their hands. What the city carried forward was not a silver bullet solution to inequality. It was a series of actions, audits, apprenticeship programs, living wage pushes, that changed some lives and set an example that other institutions could not ignore. People still struggled. Some companies took the form but not the substance of reform. Activists pushed, readers wrote, and journalists continued to trace outcomes. Leo kept teaching. Once in a while he would ride past the atrium where the safe had sat, and think of the way a simple, honest act had unraveled and then reknitted a part of his life. He kept the photograph of his sister in his jacket pocket. He left the public role when he wanted to, and returned when a new cohort of apprentices needed a voice. He never let success soften the edge of his humility. Years later, at a small community award ceremony, someone presented Leo with a wrench painted gold for the symbolic sake of the night. He laughed and set it down gently on a table, offended by the gilding. The honor meant more than the object.
It meant recognition that the world had shifted enough to notice everyday competence. The story, the one that started with a billionaire's laugh and a man's patient hands, settled into the city's memory as a parable, a reminder that promises spoken in public are heavier than blithe words, and that dignity, once acknowledged, never quite disappears. It also became a caution about spectacle, that entertainment at the expense of others breeds consequences that can be costly and instructive. On quiet mornings, Victor sometimes stood at his office window and watched the patterns of the city, and he no longer measured them only by margins. He thought of the notary's stamp, of Don Alberto's cautious voice, of Carolina's steady resolve, and of Leo's refusal to be small in front of a laugh.
He would call Leo occasionally, not to ask for favors or headlines, but to consult about training modules or to invite him to speak to apprentices. Those calls were small gestures, but they were significant. They were a way of keeping what had happened honest. In the end, the wager was remembered not as a stunt, but as a lesson. The millionaire had laughed. The biker, quiet, imperturbable, had surprised him. The surprise was not merely in the opening of a safe. It was in the recognition that a single act of seeing, recognizing a person's skill and responding to it, could trigger changes that rippled across institutions and lives. If you found this story moving, share it with someone who needs a reminder that dignity matters and words have weight. Tell it to a friend, bring it into conversation, or simply pass it along, because sometimes a single shared story is the kind of small action that keeps the work of justice moving forward.